Hej och välkomna till konsthistoriepodden på resande fot. Jag heter Alexandra Frid.
Och jag heter Alexandra Härligt.
Och vi sitter kanske på det mest otippade stället i världen. Vi sitter på en restaurang i Santa Fe som heter Cowgirls och precis ätit lite middag och smält dagen. Vi har haft mycket för oss idag. Vi började dagen med att tittade på den lokala konsten och hantverket som finns här i Santa Fe. Santa Fe är väldigt litet, kan vi börja med att säga. Man tror, i och med att det är en sån känd stad så tror man att det ska vara mycket större, men det är verkligen en väldigt pytteliten stad och det mesta är centrerat kring The Plaza. Där det finns olika aktiviteter, restauranger, affärer och så vidare. Och där ligger också några av de viktigaste museerna i Santa Fe och kanske i New Mexico.
Och det finns ganska många museer och gallerier på ganska lite
utrymme.
Ja. Det som man kan säga först när man kommer från Los Angeles till Santa Fe, det är ju att allt är så väldigt litet och det är så väldigt lugnt. Det känns inte så här nu, men det är verkligen en väldigt stillsam liten stad och framförallt med väldigt, vad ska man säga, lågt tempo. Det är väldigt, allting verkar väldigt, alltså allt går mycket långsammare.
Allting går sin gilla gång. Ja. Människor kommer, människor går, de tittar runt på de här gallerierna och de här. Det är väldigt mycket silversmider man säljer här som ursprungsbefolkningen säljer i olika affärer.
Det finns ju olika grupper av den ursprungliga befolkningen. Ja. Och det är ju Navajo och så är det Pueblo och så är det Cherokee och
många andra.
Och många fler. Och sen finns det ju de här, alltså mycket som du sa, silversmidesarbeten och mycket den här turkosa stenen som bryts. Både i New Mexico och även i Arizona och i Texas och som man arbetar med. Sen är det en hel del keramik som man kan köpa. Och allt har ju de typiska dekorationerna. Geometriska mönster och lite abstraherade djur och så vidare.
Ja, och samtidigt som man också kan se influenser till kolonialismen och även till det sydamerikanska och det mexikanska kan man ju se också i de visuella uttrycken.
Ja. Så det är egentligen en liten smältdegel här med de här olika kulturer som man nu ändå tänker att de har funnits länge på plats, men de har blandat ihop sina konstuttryck väldigt mycket i den här stilen som vi har här i New Mexico.
Det som är verkligen framträdande i den här staden, eller inte i staden men runt om, det är ju naturen, verkar det som.
Ja, för det första så är vi ju här på en väldigt hög plats.
Just det. Jag minns inte hur högt det är nu, men vi är väldigt högt uppe i alla fall. Uppe på en platå.
Ja, precis. Och så finns det ju också det finns ju berg där man kan åka skidor, inte just nu, men
på vintern
blir det väldigt kallt här på nätterna i alla fall.
Och det blir tydligen jättemånga varma källor här i New Mexico också. Tydligen så är det en av de mest täta områdena för varma källor i USA.
Och sen är det ju otroligt många museer som vi sa och gallerier, och det är faktiskt så här häpnadsväckande. Och idag pratade vi med museichefen på Georgia O'Keeffe Museum som faktiskt har skrivit sin avhandling om detta fenomen. För det har varit ganska tidigt, redan i början på 1900-talet, då det har funnits vissa mecenater som har liksom
kommit ut till New Mexico från New York och Kalifornien och så vidare och liksom tagit hit konstnärer. Så den här orten har varit som en konstnärskoloni. Ja, man kan nästan säga att det är har varit en konstnärskoloni i drygt 100 år, och det är ju ganska gammalt för att vara i USA. Och vi pratade om tidigare hur det måste ha känts att kommit hit när det inte ens fanns i princip etablerade vägar. Man befann sig i det här landskapet som är otroligt vackert, men som sagt det måste ha varit väldigt annorlunda från att ha kommit från en större stad.
Ja. Som sagt så pratade vi med museichefen på Georgia O'Keeffe museum, och han nämner ju då att när Georgia O'Keeffe kommer hit 1929 för första gången, så finns det alltså redan många konstnärer, och det finns en miljö att ansluta sig till.
Men hon blir ganska snabbt en person att räkna med i det här området, eller i Santa Fe, så som vi förstår det.
Ja.
Och nu så kommer ni få lyssna på en del av intervjun som vi gjorde med Cody Hartley om Georgia O'Keeffe och hennes konstnärskap, och han berättar lite om museet som han är chef för och hur det fungerar och så vidare.
Sure. I grew up with family that had spent a lot of time in New Mexico, so I heard many stories about this place as a kid. I visited for the first time in the early 90s and was fascinated by the cultural richness of the region, the natural beauty. I continued to visit for many years. I eventually ended up writing my master's and dissertation on topics related to New Mexico and Santa Fe, and then thought I had New Mexico out of my system. Was living and working on the East Coast, and the O'Keeffe Museum called and invited me to apply for a position here. And I took the leap and have never regretted it. It's been an amazing career here at the O'Keeffe Museum. I've been here 10 years now, and it's kind of a magical, wonderful place to work and live.
So what's it like being a director of such an important institution?
It's really an honor. It is both an opportunity and an obligation to do right by the legacy of Georgia O'Keeffe, to ensure that we are continuing to preserve and share our collections, her homes, but also to really support storytelling so that audiences across the globe have access to this remarkable example, a life of creativity, of courage, of independence and self-determination, and doing that in ways that make her life and her example relevant to contemporary experiences. On a day-to-day basis, there's a heavy kind of administrative load in terms of keeping the organization running, fundraising for projects and to support our educational programs and so forth. But again, at all points, it's really about how do we ensure that we are managing O'Keeffe's story and legacy for the future, while taking care of our immediate community and our national, international audience.
And how many visitors do you have per year, approximately?
We'll see around 150,000 visitors this year. We currently actually have a cap on the number of visitors per day in order to preserve the quality of the experience in the galleries. We are in the process of building a new, larger museum building, which will allow us to welcome well over 200,000 visitors a year.
Could you tell us something about your New Mexican related thesis, your research on New Mexico? What was that about?
Sure. So one of the things that really surprised me when I first visited Santa Fe was the number of museums, the number of galleries, the richness of the artistic scene. It's a relatively small community. It's about 70,000 in Santa Fe proper. And it's a little hard to get to. We're not, there's no major airports here. It's not easy to get here. And I was surprised to see just such an incredible, again, richness of cultural resources. And I wanted to understand how that came to happen. Yeah. So I started learning more about New Mexico's history. I looked at both the Spanish colonial history of New Mexico, tried to understand the indigenous presence and history of New Mexico, through my master's thesis, and then in the dissertation, I really looked at the creation of the museum system. So Santa Fe in New Mexico is unique in having a very robust state-funded, state-supported museum system that includes our Fine Arts Museum, our Folk Art Museum, Museum of Indian Art and Culture, as well as sites throughout the rest of the state. I wanted to know how that happened. And I went back to the early 20th century and the creation of modern Santa Fe and the community of folks, collectors, cultural boosters, politicians, who recognized that Santa Fe's economic lifeblood, which had been serving as a kind of center for trade and commerce at the end of the Santa Fe Trail, was coming to an end. And they needed to reinvent themselves in order to have a viable economic support for this community. And a number of them thought arts and tourism could be the engine that supported Santa Fe, which was really quite progressive. This is around 1912 when statehood is granted. So they supported the creation of a series of museums starting in the Palace of the Governors around the corner from here, and then leading to 1917 when they opened the Fine Arts Museum on the plaza, and then a whole series of kind of subsequent events. And so I looked at that history to understand how the idea of arts and culture was merged with the kind of destination tourism. And they used programs like free studios for artists and open exhibitions as a way of luring really substantial artists to New Mexico. So between Santa Fe and Taos and a number of art patrons, Santa Fe and New Mexico really has played an outsized role in American modernism. Through the teens, 20s, 30s, even before George O'Keeffe arrived, almost every artist you can think of working in America found their way to Santa Fe at one point or another. Some for a week, some stayed. Folks like Robert Henry, John Sloan, who were part of the Ashcan School in New York, arrived here. And then, of course, George O'Keeffe herself in 1929, and ended up making this her home for a large portion of her life. But we created a welcoming environment, if you will, for the arts. The other piece of this was support for indigenous art and really helping to define native art as fine art, not as an ethnographic curiosity, but as both a creative expression, but also a commodity, a commercial opportunity which could generate income, and the development of programs like Indian Market, which of course just happened last weekend and continues to be a really significant opportunity for native artists from across the country to sell their artwork and make often a significant portion of their annual income. So all those forces kind of came together to both create a welcoming community, but also an economically sustainable community.
So when George O'Keeffe came here in 1929 for the first time, what kind of environment was she meeting here, or why did she come here?
She came here to escape New York. She came here to take a bit of a break in her relationship with Alfred Stieglitz. The 1920s were her most prolific, successful decade in many ways. She produced a substantial amount of artwork. Alfred Stieglitz, her husband and gallerist, was hosting annual exhibitions of her paintings, and so she had to continually be producing work. She achieved critical and popular success and fame in that decade. By the end of the decade, she was tired. Alfred Stieglitz was having an affair. She was very hurt by that, and she really just needed some space. She had a number of friends in New York who had spent time in New Mexico. She was invited to visit and encouraged by people like Mabel Dodge Lujan. Mabel was a patron of the arts in New York City who had relocated here, basing her life in Taos, and had invited many, many artists to New Mexico, as well as writers and other creatives. So O'Keeffe really took the opportunity to go to a place that was very different than New York City. Would have taken quite a while to get here on the train. The roads were not paved. It was a very different looking place, both physically. The landscape is very different. The architecture would have been very different. We continue to have a very distinct visual look in this community because we've preserved and prioritized an Adobe style of architecture, using kind of earthen colors and making it very cohesive with the landscape. She would have found the rich indigenous cultures and history here. She would have found the rich Hispanic cultures here. That would have been very different than what she experienced in New York. But she also would have found a community of like-minded artists. So it would both be an opportunity for something very different, as well as some familiar faces and names.
So, in your career as an art historian, when was the first time you heard about Georgia O'Keeffe?
I actually grew up in a house filled with reproductions of O'Keeffe artworks. My mother is an artist, and Georgia O'Keeffe is her favorite artist. So I grew up reading about and hearing about Georgia O'Keeffe, seeing Georgia O'Keeffe images. I never anticipated that my life would bring me to work in this museum and really, dedicating my life to O'Keeffe's story. But that was always part of my life. I will say, when I did my dissertation on New Mexico, I very intentionally ended it before 1929. Because I didn't want to wrestle with Georgia O'Keeffe's legacy in New Mexico. I thought that would be too much to take on. And ironically, I guess the universe decided that I was going to work with that legacy one way or another. Yeah. But I think O'Keeffe is such an iconic and important artist that it's almost impossible to study American art history. And I think at this point, art history anywhere in the world without some awareness of Georgia O'Keeffe. Certainly in my very first art history survey classes, as in my undergraduate education, she was taught. I wrote a paper, I remember distinctly a paper about Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz and his photographs of her in one of my very first art history classes. So there are many roads leading me here, I suppose. I just didn't quite know it at the time.
Do you know at what time her name became an important name in American art history? Was it like early?
It really was quite early,
yeah.
And this is what makes one of the things that makes her so unique is she's invited by Alfred Stieglitz to. She's living and working in West Texas. She's invited by Alfred Stieglitz to move to New York for a year in 1918 and paint, and just see if she can really make it as a painter professionally. She'd been teaching previously. She achieves, again, with Alfred Stieglitz's gallery and high visibility. He was perhaps the most well-known gallerist in New York City at that point, showing the most contemporary avant-garde art from both America and Europe at that time. And so with his gallery kind of behind her, she achieved high visibility among critics and collectors very, very quickly in the early 20s. The two of them together were very savvy as business people and as marketers. So throughout that decade, she continued to have very high visibility among critics. In many ways, she was recognized as kind of the single woman in American art, in a moment when opportunities for education, opportunities for professional career in the arts were very, very limited for women. And she was able to overcome those kind of societal limitations and launch her career in an almost singular way. There are very few others even in that decade that achieved anything like her level of fame and success. Throughout her lifetime, her reputation continued to grow. And then I think it's worth recognizing and acknowledging that for the field of art history, through the 60s and 70s, as feminism really took a hold within art historical studies and people recognized that they'd been overlooking a huge piece of human creativity, O'Keeffe was one of the first artists really picked up and celebrated, not just for her art, but for her gender, which was a complicated subject. She had kind of a mixed feelings about that. She did not love the idea of feminism. As she often said, she did not want to be known as a great woman painter. She wanted to be known as a great painter, period, and not have her gender identifying. At the same time, as someone like Judy Chicago pointed out, O'Keeffe might not have needed feminism to succeed. She succeeded kind of independently. But there are lots of other artists who did need O'Keeffe's example and could benefit from her own path and guide, the kind of example.
Nu har vi lyssnat på Cody Hartley och på oss när vi har pratat om Georgia O'Keeffe och Georgia O'Keeffe-museet.
Ska vi fördjupa oss nu mer i ursprungsbefolkningens konst också, som det finns en del spännande museer om här i Santa Fe. Och sen bär det redan vidare till
Houston.
Texas. Ja, precis. Vi lämnar New Mexico och tar oss till nästa stat. Ja, spännande.
Ja, det är en otroligt spännande resa. Ja, hej då!
Hej då!